Hello everybody, welcome back to this year's tropical update for September 29th. We're currently watching Tropical Storm Ian, which has now made its way off of the other side of Florida, now over the Atlantic, and will be making its way towards South Carolina, where hurricane warnings are in effect. On the screen here right now, you can see the rainfall over the past 24 hours. You see values well in excess of a foot there in yellow, and in some areas perhaps even 2 feet. Again, we're still waiting on those totals, which we won't know for quite some time. Tropical Depression 11 is also expected to dissipate soon. We are also watching a new area of interest off the coast of Africa for potential development. Here's the current satellite image of the Atlantic. As you can see, Ian much more ragged today and infused with dry air after its course through Florida. Here is the impact map today. High risk, mainly due to rainfall, mainly due to storm surge, over portions of the South Carolina coastline there, where storm surge could reach 4 to 6 feet. Storm surge also expected to continue through northeast Florida, Georgia, the rest of South Carolina, as well as portions of North Carolina up to Duck, North Carolina. It is worth noting that the storm surge in Florida, in northeastern Florida, is higher now than it was during Hurricane Matthew just a few years ago. Also, rainfall is going to be continuing concern over much of the areas in yellow, and rain is possible throughout the areas in blue. As I mentioned, 11 won't develop, and we're watching an area of interest as well. No threat to land with either of those. Here is the zoomed in satellite image of severe tropical storm Ian this afternoon. As you can see, the center has moved off the coast, off the Space Coast, making its way towards South Carolina. You'll see that a bit better, well, maybe not, here on radar here in a second. You'll see the radar, but it might not be easier to see for you. Tropical storm warnings are in effect for much of the Florida coastline on the east side, as well as a hurricane watch from northeastern Florida throughout the Georgia coast. A tropical storm warning is also in effect for much of the North Carolina coast. Hurricane warning is in effect for the entirety of the South Carolina coast, where tropical storm warning or storm surge warnings are also in effect for the entirety of the South Carolina coast, the entirety of the Georgia coast, and much of northeastern Florida as well. Storm surge watches are in effect for much of North Carolina, especially on the south side. As I mentioned, flooding will continue, 6 to 10 inches widespread throughout South Carolina, storm surge in excess of 7 feet. A wide swath of winds, as you can see right now, it stretches from the Gulf of Mexico basically to as wide as North Carolina. That is a very large wind field associated with Ian, and tornadoes remain possible, especially along South and North Carolina as it moves northward today and tomorrow. As you can see here, if we kind of come out a little bit from Orlando, there's the center of the storm. You can also see the watches and warnings in effect for much of both the ocean and the inland impacts throughout Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina. And so that's kind of the extent of those watches and warnings. Flooding rain remains a concern, with major flooding still possible over much of the state, if not the entire state of South Carolina and North Carolina, as well as portions of Virginia, and of course continuing but diminishing, thankfully, over Florida, where the rain will continue to subside with time and the recovery efforts can begin. Early reports from Lee County, Florida are estimating death toll in the hundreds, not surprising considering the fact that Fort Myers has been absolutely devastated by this storm, not to mention Tampa also completely devastated, and I assume everywhere in between those two has been absolutely just taken over by storm surge along the coastline there. So an insane storm, arguably one of the biggest, if not the biggest, in Florida history. I'll talk about that a little more here at the end of the video. But the storm is ongoing. It is still a very strong tropical storm, expected to once again become a hurricane before making landfall in South Carolina. Again, 4 to 7 feet of storm surge are still possible with this storm across portions of South Carolina, with 4 to 6 feet throughout much of the Georgia coastline, as well as northeastern Florida, and still significant storm surge all the way as far north as Duck, North Carolina, And according to the hurricane threats and impacts, we could still see storm surge as far north as the southern Virginia, all of Virginia. I guess that's all of Virginia. Wow. Okay, there we go. Storm surge is still continuing, but should be subsiding from Bonita Beach down to Chickalowski. That's the Naples Marco Island area there. Wind is also a concern. As I mentioned, this thing is going to make landfall again, likely as a low-end Category 1 hurricane. Not that the wind is the main concern with this one, although it certainly did not help the fact that there were 12-foot storm surges along the western Florida coastline. No more 12-foot storm surge, but still, like I said, up to 7 feet. Wind will remain a concern. Possible hurricane force winds along the immediate South Carolina coast where the storm makes landfall. Tornadoes are a concern as well. Storm Prediction Center has a 5% chance of tornadoes over much of North Carolina as well as into Virginia tomorrow. There's also a smaller threat today as well. As I mentioned, likely to become a low-end Category 1 hurricane. It may just remain a tropical storm, though, likely to make landfall in about a day from now in South Carolina, where then it will dissipate in the next day or two. Tropical Depression 11, located over the central Atlantic. No land in sight. The deep convection is moving away from the center, getting kind of dislocated, losing its tropical characteristics, and that's what's expected to happen with this one. Winds currently at 35 miles per hour. We're also watching an area of interest off the coast of Africa with a 30% chance of formation in the next 5 days. That's reflected here on the 0Z European ensemble models, which take this storm out to sea. Whether or not it actually continues to go out to sea or not is still the test of time. We'll have to see. It does, on all models, bring Ian back into the United States, as does the GFS, and that is that story. That's enough with forecasting. Let's turn to the records. Fort Myers recording their highest storm surge on record at 7.01 feet yesterday. And that almost doubles it, more than doubles the previous record set by Tropical Storm Keith in 1988. Had more storm surge than Irma did in Fort Myers, more storm surge than Charley did in Fort Myers. Again, that's only in Fort Myers, still significant nonetheless. Most rain within 24 hours in Orlando at 12.49 inches, beating out the Homestead Hurricane, which was the previous record holder from 1945 by a significant margin. So the most rain in 24 hours in Orlando, now a new record. Ian is now tied for the fourth fastest windfall with a wind with landfall in the state of Florida, behind Labor Day, Andrew, and Michael, tied with the Florida Keys, and of course Charley, where it made landfall in almost the exact same location. But of course, Ian was bigger. Ian arguably more devastating than Charley was. And that's just the preliminary guesses. Lake Okeechobee, Great Miami, and Donna rank behind the Florida Keys, Ian, and Charley. It also ranks as tied for the fifth fastest winds in the contiguous United States, behind the same Labor Day, Andrew, and Michael Florida landfalls, while also including Camille, and tied with a few bonus ones like the Indianola Hurricane of 1886, Ida in 2021, which made landfall in Louisiana, as we remember, Lass Island in 1856, Freeport in 1932. So again, this is in the company of significant storms that probably all the names on the list, and all the names on this list too. The fastest winds on a United States landfall. The additions to this list from the previous one are Karen in 1962, as well as U2 in 2018, which made landfall in Guam in the Pacific. It's also worth noting Maria, just 5 miles an hour stronger than Ian was. If I were to go out on a limb here, and I don't think it's that far of a limb to go out on, Ian is the Maria of Western Florida. And you remember how Maria devastated Puerto Rico, and they're still recovering. And Fiona certainly didn't help that a week probably ago. Ian, my guess, is on par with Maria, unfortunately. All based off of the damage I've seen, in the reports that are coming out of Florida, that's my guess. So significant. That's the way to put it, and it's not done yet. South Carolina is next, likely as a hurricane. Hurricane warnings in effect there. That's all for now. Chris Dixon for our Catholic video.